Wyoming Territory, October 1878. The screech of twisted metal and dying steam filled the mountain air as the Union Pacific locomotive careened off the tracks, dragging 5 freight cars down the rocky embankment. Samuel Carter felt his legs crushed beneath 1,000 pounds of steel as the rail car he'd been coupling flipped sideways. Blood filled his mouth as he tried to scream, but only silence came. Around him, other railroad men lay motionless in the wreckage, their bodies bent at impossible angles. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Help! Sam whispered into the thin mountain air, his voice lost in the settling dust and the distant echo of avalanche. His massive frame, all 6 feet 7 inches of solid muscle, now seemed fragile as a child's toy crushed beneath the weight of progress itself. The last thing he remembered before darkness took him was the sound of his own bones snapping like kindling, and the bitter knowledge that his body would never be the same. Thunder Creek Valley, Wyoming Territory, September 1879. Nearly a year had passed since the accident that ended Sam Carter's railroad career and left him with a permanent limp, but he'd built something remarkable from the ashes of his broken dreams. The Iron Bar Ranch stretched across 800 acres of prime grazing land, nestled between the Bighorn Mountains and the rushing waters of Thunder Creek. His cattle operation had grown from a handful of scraggly longhorns to over 300 head of prime beef, and his reputation as a fair but demanding rancher had spread throughout the territory. Sam stood on the covered porch of his 2-story ranch house, a structure he'd built with his own scarred hands from timber he'd cut himself. The morning mist hung low over the valley, and the first hints of autumn color touched the aspen groves that dotted the hillsides. At 34 he commanded respect throughout Thunder Creek Valley, but the loneliness ate at him like a slow poison. His nearest neighbor Henry Muller lived 8 miles away, and the town of Willow Creek was a hard 15-mile ride through treacherous mountain passes. The ranch house stood as a testament to his determination, with thick log walls that could withstand the brutal Wyoming winters and a stone chimney that drew perfectly on even the windiest days. He'd furnished it simply but well, with sturdy oak furniture made by the German carpenter in town and thick wool rugs purchased from traveling merchants. The kitchen featured a massive cast-iron stove capable of feeding a dozen ranch hands, and the upstairs bedrooms remained empty, waiting for a family he'd begun to doubt would ever come. Sam's morning routine never varied. He rose before dawn, checked the horses in the barn, pumped fresh water from the well he'd dug himself, and surveyed his land from the porch while drinking coffee strong enough to wake the dead. This particular morning felt different, charged with an energy he couldn't identify. The horses seemed restless in their stalls and the cattle gathered in unusual patterns near the creek. Even the weather felt unsettled, with storm clouds building over the distant peaks despite the season being too early for serious snow. His foreman, a weathered cowboy named Jake Summers, approached the house leading a saddled horse. Jake had worked cattle drives from Texas to Montana, and knew more about livestock than any man Sam had ever met, but he'd been acting strange for the past week, avoiding eye contact and speaking only when directly addressed. "Boss," Jake said, his voice carrying an odd formality, "got word from town yesterday. Stagecoach broke an axle about 5 miles up Miller's Crossing. Passengers are stranded at Muller's store waiting for repairs." Sam nodded, unsurprised. The mountain roads were hard on wagon wheels, and Henry Muller's general store often served as an unofficial way station for travelers. "They need supplies." "Well," Jake hesitated, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Henry sent word that one of the passengers is asking about work. Domestic work, specifically. Young woman traveling alone, says she's got experience keeping house for wealthy families." This information struck Sam as odd. Women traveling alone through Wyoming Territory were rare, and those seeking domestic work in such a remote area were almost unheard of. Most unmarried women who ventured west did so with family, or as mail-order brides with specific destinations. A woman looking for random employment in the wilderness suggested either desperation or something more complicated. What kind of woman travels alone looking for work in the middle of nowhere? Sam asked, voicing his suspicion. Jake shrugged, but his eyes held a knowledge he wasn't sharing. "The kind that might be running from something, I suppose. Henry says she's well-spoken, clean, obviously educated, Irish accent but American manners, seems to know her way around a kitchen and can read and write better than most men." The mention of education intrigued Sam. His own schooling had ended at 14 when his father died, and he'd taken work to support his mother and younger siblings. He'd taught himself to read better over the years, collecting books whenever possible, but he still struggled with complex writing. The idea of having someone around who could help with correspondence and record-keeping appealed to him almost as much as the prospect of decent meals and a clean house. "Tell Henry I'll ride over this afternoon," Sam decided. "If this woman is legitimate, I might have work for her. Lord knows this place could use a woman's touch." The ride to Muller's store took Sam through some of the most beautiful country in the territory. Thunder Creek wound through stands of cottonwood and aspen, their leaves just beginning to turn gold and crimson. The trail climbed gradually through pine forests thick with the scent of resin and autumn earth, then descended into the broader valley where Henry Muller had built his combination general store, post office, and informal community center. Muller's establishment sat at the intersection of two mountain trails, making it a natural gathering place for the scattered ranchers and homesteaders of the region. The building itself was a substantial log structure with a covered porch and hitching posts worn smooth by countless horses. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Sam could see 3 horses tied to the rail, including one that definitely didn't belong to anyone from the local area. Henry Muller emerged from the store before Sam had finished dismounting. The German immigrant was a stocky man in his 50s with a gray beard and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He'd arrived in the territory 5 years earlier with his wife Anna, and had quickly become the unofficial mayor of their scattered community. "Samuel," Henry called out in his thick accent, "I am glad you came. This young lady, she is in quite the situation." "What kind of situation?" Sam asked, suddenly wary. "Come inside, you will see. But I warn you, she is not what you might expect." The interior of Muller's store smelled of coffee, leather, and the various goods Henry kept in stock for his customers. Bolts of fabric lined one wall, while another held tools, ammunition, and household supplies. A pot-bellied stove provided warmth, and several chairs arranged around it served as an informal meeting area. In one of these chairs sat a young woman who immediately captured Sam's attention. She was tiny, probably not more than 5 feet tall, with dark auburn hair pinned up in a simple but neat style. Her dress was plain brown wool, well made but clearly not new, and she wore sturdy leather boots suitable for rough country. What struck Sam most were her eyes, a brilliant green that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing of her thoughts. She rose as he entered, and Sam noticed she moved with a careful grace that suggested both strength and caution. When she looked up at him, her eyes widened slightly at his.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
His imposing height, but she didn't step back or show fear as many people did upon meeting him for the first time. "Miss O'Brien," Henry said, "this is Samuel Carter, the rancher I mentioned." "Samuel, meet Miss Margaret O'Brien, Mr. Carter," she said, extending a small work-roughened hand. Her voice carried the melodic lilt of Ireland beneath carefully practiced American pronunciation. "I understand you might have need of domestic help." Sam shook her hand gently, aware that his own massive palm could easily crush her delicate fingers. "That's right, Miss O'Brien. Though I have to ask, what brings a young woman like you to the middle of the Wyoming wilderness looking for work?" Something flickered in her green eyes, gone too quickly for him to identify. "Personal circumstances, Mr. Carter. Sometimes a person needs to start fresh in a new place." The answer told him nothing while confirming his suspicion that she was running from something. Sam glanced at Henry, who nodded slightly as if to say he'd already had this conversation and gotten the same non-answers. "What kind of domestic experience do you have?" Sam asked. "I've managed households for wealthy families in Boston and Chicago," Margaret replied. "I can cook, clean, handle laundry, manage supplies, and keep accounts. I've also helped with correspondence for employers who needed assistance with their business writing." This last bit caught Sam's attention immediately. His own writing was functional but rough, and he often struggled with the formal language required for business dealings. Having someone who could handle correspondence would be invaluable. The work would be demanding, Sam warned. "My ranch is 15 miles from here, and winter comes early in the mountains. Once the snows start, you might not see another soul besides me and my foreman for months at a time. It's not work for someone who needs constant company or entertainment." Margaret's chin lifted slightly, a gesture that suggested more steel beneath her petite exterior than her appearance suggested. "I'm not afraid of hard work or isolation, Mr. Carter. I've learned to rely on myself." There was something in the way she said it that convinced Sam she was telling the truth about being self-reliant. He found himself curious about what had driven such a young woman to seek work in such a remote location, but he sensed that pressing for details would only make her more guarded. "The position would include room and board," Sam continued. Private quarters in the ranch house, meals and $30 a month in wages. In return I'd expect the house kept clean, meals prepared, laundry handled, and help with ranch paperwork when needed. Does that sound acceptable? He watched her face carefully as he stated the terms. $30 a month was generous wages for domestic work, especially in such a remote area, and he saw her eyes widen slightly with surprise before she composed herself. Very acceptable, Mr. Carter. When would you like me to start? Today if you're willing. The stage won't be repaired until tomorrow anyway, and there's no point in you spending another night sleeping in Henry's storage room. Margaret glanced toward the back of the store, where Sam assumed she'd been staying, then back at him. He could see her weighing her options, considering whether accepting immediate employment with a stranger was wise. Finally she nodded. I'll gather my belongings. Her belongings, it turned out, consisted of a single small carpet bag and a worn leather satchel. Sam found himself wondering what kind of life a person could pack into such a small space, but he didn't ask. Everyone in the territory had stories they preferred not to share, and he respected that privacy. The ride back to Iron Bar Ranch gave Sam a chance to observe his new employee more closely. Margaret rode side saddle on the gentle mare Henry had loaned her, and despite her small size, she handled the horse with competent ease. She didn't chatter or ask unnecessary questions, but she did pay close attention to landmarks and the route they were taking, as if memorizing her surroundings. Have you spent much time in ranch country? Sam asked as they paused to rest the horses beside Thunder Creek. No, Margaret replied, but I've always been a quick learner. What should I know about managing a ranch house? Sam appreciated the practical nature of her question. Biggest difference from city housekeeping is that everything takes longer and requires more planning. If you run out of supplies, you can't just walk to the corner store. We have to think weeks ahead, especially as winter approaches. Also, the work is heavier. We don't have gas lines or city water, so everything from heating to cooking to washing requires more physical effort. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. What about your men? How many ranch hands should I expect to cook for? Just Jake Summers, my foreman, most of the time. He has his own cabin about a quarter-mile from the main house, but he usually takes his meals with me. During roundup or branding, I might hire temporary help, but those men camp out and handle their own cooking. As they approached the ranch, Sam found himself seeing his property through Margaret's eyes. The main house dominated a slight rise overlooking the creek, with the barn and outbuildings arranged in a practical cluster nearby. Cattle dotted the pastures, and the mountains provided a dramatic backdrop to the entire scene. It was beautiful country, but Sam realized it might seem intimidatingly vast and empty to someone accustomed to city life. Margaret said nothing as they rode up to the house, but Sam noticed her taking in every detail. When they dismounted, she stood for a moment looking around, and he thought he saw something like relief in her expression, as if she'd found exactly what she was looking for. It's beautiful, she said simply. Sam felt an unexpected warmth at her approval. Built most of it myself, he said, then immediately felt foolish for boasting like a schoolboy. If Margaret noticed his embarrassment, she was kind enough not to show it. Would you show me the house? I'd like to understand what needs to be done. The interior of the ranch house reflected Sam's practical nature and his lack of experience with domestic arrangements. The main room featured a large stone fireplace, comfortable but mismatched furniture, and a dining table that could seat 8 but was currently covered with ranch paperwork. The kitchen was well equipped, but showed signs of bachelor housekeeping, with dishes stacked haphazardly and surfaces that needed thorough cleaning. Margaret walked through each room without comment, her expression neutral. Sam found himself holding his breath, waiting for her reaction. The house was sturdy and functional, but he suddenly realized how rough it must seem to someone accustomed to the fine homes of wealthy families. The stove is excellent, she said finally, running her hand along the cast iron surface, and you have good light in the kitchen. I'll be able to work efficiently here. Sam felt relief wash over him. Your room is upstairs, he said, leading her to the second floor. You can choose whichever you prefer. They're all furnished basically, but you can arrange things however you like. Margaret chose the room at the front of the house, which offered a view of the mountains and the approach to the ranch. Sam noticed her checking the window locks and the strength of the door, small actions that reinforced his suspicion that she was hiding from something or someone. I'll leave you to get settled, Sam said. Supper is usually at 6, nothing fancy. If you're too tired tonight, I can handle it myself. I'm not too tired, Margaret replied firmly. I'll prepare the meal, it's why you hired me. As Sam made his way downstairs, he reflected on the strange turn his day had taken. This morning he'd awakened to the same lonely routine he'd followed for months, and now he had a mysterious young woman under his roof, someone who might finally bring life to his empty house. He found himself looking forward to supper for the first time in longer than he cared to remember. The sound of Margaret moving around upstairs, unpacking her few belongings and making the room her own, struck him as remarkably comforting. For the first time since the railroad accident that had changed his life, Sam Carter allowed himself to hope that his future might hold something more than just solitary survival in the wilderness. Outside, storm clouds continued to build over the mountains, and the first cold wind of autumn rustled through the aspen groves. Winter would come early this year, Sam could feel it in his bones, but for the first time in months, the prospect of being snowed in didn't seem quite so bleak. Margaret O'Brien descended the stairs at 5:30, her footsteps light on the wooden planks Sam had cut and fitted himself. She'd changed from her travel dress into a simple blue work dress with a white apron, and her auburn hair was now braided and pinned in a practical style that wouldn't interfere with cooking. Sam looked up from the ranch ledgers he'd been pretending to study, and felt his breath catch slightly. Even in plain work clothes, there was something striking about her presence that filled the empty spaces of his house, in a way he hadn't expected. "I've taken inventory of your pantry and root cellar," Margaret said without preamble, moving toward the kitchen with purposeful strides. "You're well stocked with basics, though I noticed you're low on several spices, and you have no proper baking supplies. I can make a list for your next trip to town." Sam nodded, impressed by her efficiency. Most people took days to fully explore a new place, but Margaret had clearly spent her time upstairs productively, learning the layout and resources of her new workplace. "Henry stocks most everything we need, though some items have to be ordered from Cheyenne. What did you have in mind for supper?" "Nothing elaborate tonight," she replied, already tying her apron and washing her hands at the kitchen pump. "But I noticed you have excellent beef hanging in your cold house, and there are still decent vegetables from your garden. I can do better than whatever you've been eating." There was a gentle teasing in her tone that made Sam smile. His cooking consisted mainly of fried beef, boiled potatoes, and whatever canned goods he could open, hardly the kind of meals a proper household should serve. He'd grown accustomed to simple fare, but he found himself curious about what a woman with experience in wealthy households might produce from his basic supplies. The transformation that occurred over the next hour fascinated Sam more than he cared to admit. Margaret moved through his kitchen with the confidence of someone who understood her craft completely, turning his utilitarian workspace into something that seemed almost magical. She seasoned the beef with herbs he didn't know he owned, prepared vegetables in combinations he'd never considered, and somehow produced fresh bread, despite the fact that he was certain he had no proper flour for baking. "Where did the bread come from?" he asked when she set a golden loaf on the table beside plates that actually matched. Another mystery, since he was sure he only owned mismatched crockery. "You had flour, it just needed some attention," Margaret replied, slicing the bread with practiced motions. "And I found your good dishes in the cabinet. They were just dusty from disuse." Sam realized he'd forgotten about the china set his mother had given him before he'd left home, pieces that had been wedding gifts to her and his father decades earlier. He'd packed them carefully when he'd moved west, but had never bothered to use them, considering them too fine for his rough bachelor existence. Seeing them on his table, properly set with real napkins, Margaret had somehow made the ranch house feel more like a home than it had since he'd built it. Jake Summers arrived just as Margaret was placing the final dishes on the table, and Sam watched his foreman's reaction with amusement. Jake stopped short in the doorway, his weather-beaten face showing surprise at the transformed dining area, and the delicious smells emanating from the kitchen. "Evening, ma'am," Jake said, removing his hat and smoothing his graying hair with obvious nervousness. "I'm Jake Summers, Mr. Carter's foreman." "Margaret O'Brien," she replied with a warm smile that put Jake immediately at ease. "I hope you're hungry, Mr. Summers. I'm afraid I cooked enough for an army, not knowing everyone's appetite." The meal that followed was unlike anything Sam had experienced in his own home. The beef was tender and flavorful, the vegetables cooked perfectly, and the bread warm and fresh from his own oven. More than the food itself, though, was the atmosphere Margaret had created. The table looked welcoming with its proper place settings, and a small arrangement of late-season flowers she'd gathered from somewhere. Conversation flowed naturally, with Margaret asking thoughtful questions about the ranch operation and the local area, without seeming to pry into personal matters. "How long have you worked for Mr. Carter?" she asked Jake as he helped himself to a second serving of everything. "About 3 years now," Jake replied. "Started here when Sam was just getting the cattle operation going. Best boss I've worked for, treats his men fair and knows the business inside and out." Sam felt a flush of pride at Jake's words. Building a good reputation in ranch country was crucial, and having the respect of experienced hands like Jake meant everything in establishing credibility with other ranchers and potential business partners. "What made you choose cattle ranching?" Margaret asked Sam directly, her green eyes curious but not intrusive. Sam considered his answer carefully. The truth was complicated, involving his railroad accident, and the need to find work he could do despite his injured leg, but he wasn't ready to share those details with someone he'd just met. "Seemed like good country for it," he said finally. "Wide open spaces, good grass, access to water. A man can build something lasting here if he's willing to work hard." Margaret nodded thoughtfully, as if she understood there was more to the story than he was sharing. "It's beautiful land," she said. "Very different from what I'm accustomed to, but I can see the appeal of having space to breathe." There was something in the way she said it that suggested she understood the desire to escape from something, to find a place where a person could start over without the weight of the past pressing down on them. Sam found himself wondering what she was escaping from, but he respected her privacy just as she respected his. After supper, Jake excused himself to return to his cabin, thanking Margaret profusely for the finest meal he'd eaten in months. Sam helped Margaret clear the dishes, noting how she organized the kitchen cleanup with the same efficiency she'd brought to the cooking. Within an hour, the kitchen was spotless, and everything put away in logical places that somehow made more sense than his previous arrangements. "You don't have to reorganize everything," Sam said as he watched her systematically improving his storage systems. "I know where things are. I'm not criticizing your methods," Margaret replied diplomatically. "But if I'm going to be cooking regularly, I need to know where supplies are, and have them arranged for efficient work. I hope you don't mind." Sam realized he didn't mind at all. In fact, he was impressed by her thoughtful approach to improving his systems without making him feel incompetent. She managed to enhance everything while somehow making it seem like a natural collaboration, rather than a takeover of his domestic space. As evening settled over the valley, Sam found himself reluctant to end the day. For the first time in months, his house felt alive with another person's presence, and the prospect of returning to solitary evenings seemed less appealing than it had that morning. Margaret had finished her kitchen work, and was examining the books on his shelves, her face showing genuine interest in his small collection. "You have excellent taste in literature," she said, running her finger along the spine of a volume of Shakespeare. "I wasn't expecting to find such a varied selection in a ranch house. Reading helps pass the long winter evenings," Sam said, pleased that she appreciated his books. "Most of these I've collected over the years, trading with travelers, or ordering from catalogs when I could afford it." Margaret pulled out a volume of Irish poetry, and opened it carefully, her face softening as she read a familiar passage. "I haven't seen this collection in years," she said quietly. "My father used to read these poems to my mother in the evenings when I was small." It was the first personal detail she'd shared about her family, and Sam noted the past tense she used when speaking of her parents. Another piece of the puzzle that was Margaret O'Brien, though he was beginning to understand that she would reveal her story in her own time, if at all. "You're welcome to borrow any of the books," Sam offered. "I'd be interested to hear what someone with your education thinks of my collection." Margaret smiled, the first completely unguarded expression he'd seen from her. "Thank you. It's been too long since I had access to good books." The simple pleasure she took in the prospect of reading struck Sam as both touching and revealing. Whatever circumstances had brought her to Wyoming, they had apparently deprived her of things she valued, things as basic as books and the leisure time to enjoy them. He found himself wanting to ensure she had access to whatever brought her happiness, a protective instinct that surprised him with its intensity. As the evening progressed, they settled into comfortable conversation by the fireplace. Margaret proved to be an engaging companion, well informed about current events, and possessing opinions on topics ranging from politics to literature. She listened thoughtfully to Sam's views on ranch management and territorial development, asking questions that showed both intelligence and genuine interest. "Do you think Wyoming will achieve statehood soon?" she asked as Sam added another log to the fire. "Within the next decade, I'd guess," Sam replied. "The territory's growing fast, and we've got the railroad bringing in more settlers every year. Population's the main requirement, and we're getting there." "What would statehood mean for ranchers like you?" Sam considered the question seriously. "Better representation in Washington, more federal investment in infrastructure, probably more stable law enforcement. Right now we're pretty much on our own out here, which suits some folks but makes business more challenging." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "I suppose isolation has both advantages and disadvantages. Depends what you're looking for," Sam agreed. "Some people come west to get away from things, others come to build something new. Both reasons are valid." He watched Margaret's face as he spoke, noting how her expression grew more guarded when he mentioned people coming west to escape their pasts. Another confirmation that she was running from something, though he was no closer to understanding what. As the evening grew late, Margaret excused herself to retire, thanking Sam for his hospitality and expressing satisfaction with her new position. Sam remained by the fire after she'd gone upstairs, reflecting on how dramatically his life had
changed in the space of a single day. The house felt different with another person in it, warmer and more welcoming than he'd ever managed to make it on his own. He found himself listening to the sounds of Margaret moving around upstairs, the soft footsteps and quiet activities of someone settling in for the night. It struck him how long it had been since he'd shared his living space with another person, how accustomed he'd become to complete solitude. The presence of another human being in his home brought both comfort and a strange anxiety, as if he'd forgotten how to behave around people. The next morning Sam woke to the smell of coffee and bacon drifting up from the kitchen, sense that drew him downstairs earlier than usual. Margaret was already dressed and working efficiently at the stove, her movements suggesting she'd been up for some time. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," she said without turning around. "I hope you don't mind that I started breakfast. I'm accustomed to early hours." "Not at all," Sam replied, impressed by her initiative. "Smells wonderful." The breakfast she'd prepared was as impressive as the previous evening's dinner, featuring perfectly cooked eggs, crisp bacon and biscuits that were somehow lighter and more flavorful than anything Sam had ever managed to produce. She'd also organized the morning supplies more efficiently, making everything about the meal preparation seem smoother and more professional. "I was thinking about the household schedule," Margaret said as they ate. "If you could tell me about your daily routines and any preferences you have, I can organize my work to support your needs more effectively." Sam appreciated her business-like approach to establishing their working relationship. "I'm usually up before dawn to check the stock and handle morning chores," he said. "Breakfast around 7 works well, dinner at noon when I'm working close to the house, supper at 6. Beyond that I'm flexible about timing as long as the work gets done." "What about laundry, cleaning, shopping, trips to town?" "Laundry as needed, cleaning when it gets too bad to ignore," Sam said with a self-deprecating smile. "Shopping trips depend on weather and ranch business, maybe once every 2 weeks or so." Margaret nodded, clearly making mental notes about organizing these tasks into an efficient schedule. Her professional approach made Sam realize how haphazard his domestic arrangements had been, how much time and energy he'd been wasting on inefficient systems. After breakfast, Sam showed Margaret around the ranch buildings, explaining how various systems worked and where supplies were kept. She asked practical questions about everything from the cold house where meat was stored to the root cellar where vegetables were kept through winter. Her interest seemed genuine, and Sam found himself enjoying the role of teacher, explaining the details of ranch life to someone who listened attentively and asked intelligent questions. "The barn is impressive," Margaret said as they toured the large building where Sam kept his horses and equipment. "You built this yourself as well?" "Most of it," Sam replied, running his hand along one of the massive support beams he'd cut and placed himself. "Had some help with the heaviest work, but I designed and supervised the whole project." Margaret examined the construction with an appraising eye that suggested more knowledge of building than Sam might have expected from someone with her background. "You did excellent work," she said finally. "The proportions are perfect, and everything looks built to last." Her approval pleased Sam more than it should have. He'd taken pride in his construction projects, but he'd had few opportunities to show them to anyone whose opinion mattered to him. Margaret's educated assessment carried weight because she'd clearly seen quality construction in the wealthy households where she'd worked. As they walked back toward the house, Sam noticed Margaret scanning the surrounding landscape with the same careful attention she'd given to the ranch buildings. She seemed to be memorizing landmarks, noting escape routes, studying the terrain with the thoroughness of someone who might need such knowledge. "Are you expecting trouble, Miss O'Brien?" he asked directly. Margaret paused, her expression growing guarded. "I've learned to be observant about my surroundings, Mr. Carter. It's a useful habit for anyone living in unfamiliar territory." The answer told him nothing while confirming his growing certainty that she was hiding from something specific. Sam decided not to press the issue, but he made a mental note to keep his own eyes open for anything unusual. If Margaret had brought danger to his ranch, he wanted to be prepared for it. The days that followed established a routine that felt both natural and surprisingly comfortable. Margaret proved to be everything she'd promised and more, transforming the ranch house into a space that felt truly lived in for the first time since Sam had built it. Meals became events to anticipate rather than mere fuel stops, and the house stayed cleaner and more organized than he'd ever managed to achieve on his own. More than her domestic skills though, Sam found himself valuing Margaret's companionship. She was intelligent and well-read, capable of discussing everything from current events to philosophy with insight and humor. Her presence made the evening hours pass more quickly and pleasantly, and he discovered that he looked forward to their conversations almost as much as he did her cooking. Margaret, for her part, seemed to be settling into ranch life with remarkable adaptability. She learned quickly about the rhythms of rural work, anticipating Sam's needs and adjusting her schedule to support his activities. She also showed genuine interest in the cattle operation, asking questions about breeding, grazing management, and marketing that demonstrated both intelligence and practical curiosity. "How do you decide which cattle to keep for breeding?" she asked one evening as they reviewed the ranch accounts together, her assistance with paperwork proving invaluable for organizing Sam's financial records. "Look for the best combination of size, health and temperament," Sam explained, enjoying her interest in the technical aspects of ranching. "A good breeding bull needs to be aggressive enough to establish dominance but not so wild he's dangerous to handle. Cows need to be good mothers, produce plenty of milk, and have the stamina to survive harsh winters." Margaret nodded thoughtfully, making notes in the margins of the ledger where she was recording breeding records in her clear, precise handwriting. "It sounds like you're trying to create animals that can thrive in this specific environment." "Exactly," Sam said, impressed by how quickly she grasped the principles involved. "Cattle that do well in Texas might not survive a Wyoming winter, and animals that work in gentler climates might not have the toughness needed for open-range conditions." Their collaboration on ranch paperwork revealed another dimension of Margaret's capabilities. Her education was clearly superior to his own, but she managed to assist him without making him feel ignorant or incompetent. She organized his records more efficiently, helped him draft correspondence in more professional language, and identified financial patterns he'd missed on his own. "Your operation is quite profitable," she observed after reviewing several months of accounts. "More so than I think you realize." Sam looked up from the breeding records they'd been updating. "What do you mean? You've been thinking like someone who's just getting by, but your numbers show a business that's actually thriving." Margaret explained, pointing to columns of figures she'd organized. "Your costs are low because you do most of the work yourself, your cattle prices are good because you've built a reputation for quality, and you're reinvesting profits wisely and expanding the herd." The analysis surprised Sam, who'd been so focused on day-to-day survival and gradual improvement that he hadn't stepped back to look at the bigger financial picture. Seeing his operation through Margaret's educated perspective made him realize he'd been more successful than he'd understood. "Does that change anything?" he asked, curious about her assessment. "It means you have options," Margaret replied thoughtfully. "You could expand more aggressively, hire permanent help, maybe diversify into other areas. Or you could maintain the current scale and focus on improving efficiency and profitability." Sam found himself considering possibilities he'd never allowed himself to contemplate. Success had come so gradually that he'd barely noticed it accumulating, but Margaret's analysis suggested he'd reached a point where he could make choices about his future rather than simply reacting to circumstances. As autumn progressed toward winter, Sam became increasingly aware that Margaret had brought more than just domestic competence to his ranch. Her presence had changed the fundamental character of his life, making him think about the future in ways that extended beyond simple survival and gradual improvement. For the first time since his railroad accident, he found himself wondering what it might be like to build something larger than a successful ranch, something that might include family and permanent companionship. These thoughts both excited and worried him. Margaret remained a mystery in many essential ways, and he sensed that whatever had driven her to Wyoming might eventually catch up with them both. But as the first snows began to dust the mountain peaks and the days grew shorter, Sam realized he was no longer content with solitary success. Margaret O'Brien had awakened possibilities he'd thought were lost forever, and he found himself hoping that whatever storms lay ahead, they would weather them together. The first significant snowfall came earlier than expected, blanketing Thunder Creek Valley in pristine white that transformed the landscape into something magical yet ominous. Sam stood on the ranch house porch watching the heavy flakes fall steadily, knowing that this early storm likely meant a brutal winter ahead. The cattle had gathered in the lower pastures near the creek, their instincts telling them to seek shelter from the wind that howled down from the mountain peaks. Margaret appeared beside him, wrapping a thick wool shawl around her shoulders as she studied the weather with the same serious attention he'd come to associate with all her observations. Over the past month, he'd learned that she approached everything with careful analysis, whether it was organizing his kitchen or evaluating the storm patterns that would determine their winter survival. "How long do these early storms usually last?" she asked, her breath visible in the cold air. "Could be 3 days, could be a week," Sam replied, noting how the wind direction suggested the storm was settling in rather than moving through quickly. "The important thing is that we're prepared, and we are. Food stores are good, firewood is stacked, and the animals have adequate shelter." Margaret nodded, but Sam noticed she continued scanning the white expanse beyond the ranch buildings with that same watchful alertness he'd observed since her arrival. Her caution had become more pronounced as winter approached, as if she expected the isolation of the season to bring particular dangers rather than the peace most people associated with snowed-in solitude. "Is there something specific you're worried about?" Sam asked directly, no longer willing to ignore her obvious anxiety about something beyond normal winter concerns. Margaret hesitated, her green eyes reflecting an internal struggle between honesty and continued secrecy. Finally she spoke carefully, choosing her words with obvious deliberation. "Winter makes traveling difficult, which can be both a blessing and a curse depending on one's circumstances." The cryptic answer frustrated Sam, but before he could press for more details, Jake Summers emerged from the barn leading a saddled horse through the falling snow. The foreman's expression was grim as he approached the porch, and Sam immediately sensed trouble. "Boss, we got a problem," Jake called out, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Found fresh tracks near the south pasture, looked like 3 or 4 riders moving careful-like around our boundaries. Not the kind of tracks you'd expect from casual travelers." Sam felt his muscles tense instinctively. Riders scouting his property during a snowstorm suggested either rustlers evaluating his cattle, or people looking for something else entirely. His eyes moved to Margaret, whose face had gone pale at Jake's news, confirming his growing suspicion that her past had finally caught up with them. "How fresh were the tracks?" Sam asked, his mind already shifting into the tactical thinking that had kept him alive during dangerous railroad work in hostile territory. "Hour, maybe 2 at most," Jake replied. "Snow was just starting to cover them when I found the trail." They circled the whole ranch, like they were getting familiar with the layout before making some kind of move. Margaret stepped back from the porch railing, her hand unconsciously moving to her throat in a gesture that suggested barely controlled panic. Sam noticed the movement and made an immediate decision about priorities. Whatever was coming, Margaret's safety took precedence over everything else, including his own property. "Jake, get back to your cabin and stay alert," Sam instructed. "Anyone comes calling, you know nothing about our business, and you haven't seen anything unusual. Understand?" The foreman nodded grimly. Jake had worked enough rough country to recognize the signs of serious trouble, and his loyalty to Sam was absolute. "You want me to ride to town for help?" "Not in this storm," Sam decided. "Roads will be impassable within hours, and we don't know who these riders might be or what they want yet. Better to keep our heads down and see how this plays out." After Jake disappeared back toward his cabin, Sam turned to Margaret with an expression that demanded complete honesty. The time for evasion and partial truths had passed, replaced by the immediate need for survival planning. "Who's looking for you?" he asked bluntly. Margaret's composure cracked visibly, her carefully maintained facade crumbling under the weight of her fear, and the realization that her past had indeed followed her to this remote valley. Tears welled in her green eyes as she struggled to find words that would explain the complexity of her situation without revealing more danger than necessary. "His name is Vincent Castellano," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's a businessman from Chicago with interests in everything, from shipping to gambling to politics. I worked for his family for 2 years, managing his household and helping with his business correspondence." Sam waited patiently, sensing there was much more to the story. The way Margaret spoke Castellano's name suggested a relationship far more complicated than simple employment, and her obvious terror indicated consequences more severe than losing a job. "Vincent became obsessed with me," Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger as she forced herself to confront the truth she'd been hiding. "At first it seemed like harmless attention, compliments about my work, small gifts, requests that I handle more personal tasks. But gradually it became clear that he considered me his property, not his employee." The familiar pattern made Sam's blood boil. He'd seen men who believed money and power gave them ownership over anyone dependent on them, and he despised such thinking with every fiber of his being. His own experiences with powerful men who abused their authority had left him with zero tolerance for such behavior. "What happened when you tried to leave?" Sam asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "He wouldn't allow it," Margaret replied, her hands trembling as she remembered. "Said I owed him money for training me, for the clothes he'd bought me for room and board over the years. The debt kept growing no matter how much I worked, and he made it clear that I would never be free to leave his employment." Sam recognized the tactics of debt bondage, a system used to trap vulnerable people in permanent servitude. It was technically legal in many places, but morally despicable, a way for wealthy men to own human beings without calling it slavery. The fact that Castellano had pursued Margaret all the way to Wyoming Territory demonstrated both his obsessive determination and his extensive resources. "How did you finally escape?" Margaret's face flushed with what might have been shame or anger. "I stole money from his office safe enough to pay for transportation and supplies to start over somewhere he couldn't find me. He's not the kind of man who forgives theft, especially from someone he considered his possession." The admission explained Margaret's terror and her careful surveillance of their surroundings. If Castellano had indeed tracked her to Thunder Creek Valley, she faced not just return to bondage, but likely violent punishment for her escape and theft. Men like Castellano didn't accept defiance from people they considered beneath them, and they had the resources to pursue revenge across any distance. "How much money are we talking about?" Sam asked, already formulating plans for dealing with whatever confrontation might be approaching. $200, Margaret whispered. "I know it was wrong, but I saw no other way to gain my freedom." Sam almost smiled despite the gravity of their situation. $200 was a significant sum to Margaret, but hardly the kind of theft that would justify pursuing someone across half the continent, unless the pursuit was motivated by wounded pride rather than financial loss. Castellano's obsession with reclaiming his property was clearly personal rather than purely business. "Margaret," Sam said firmly, taking her trembling hands in his own massive ones, "you did nothing wrong. A person has the right to leave any employment, and taking money you were owed is hardly theft." This Castellano sounds like a man who needs to learn that human beings aren't possessions to be owned. The certainty in Sam's voice seemed to steady Margaret's nerves. For weeks she'd been carrying the burden of fear and guilt alone, believing herself a criminal fleeing justice rather than a victim escaping oppression. Having someone validate her actions and share the burden of confronting the consequences brought visible relief to her strained features. "He has men who work for him," Margaret warned. "Dangerous men who handle problems that can't be solved through legal channels. If he's sent them here, they won't hesitate to use violence to get what they want." Sam nodded grimly. He'd encountered such men during his railroad days, hired thugs who used intimidation and brutality to enforce their employer's will. They were dangerous but usually predictable, relying on fear and overwhelming force rather than skill or intelligence. Men accustomed to terrorizing helpless victims often struggled when faced with determined resistance from someone capable of fighting back. "How many men would he likely send?" "3 or 4 probably," Margaret replied. "Enough to handle any resistance but not so many as to attract unwanted attention. Vincent prefers to handle his problems quietly." Sam considered their tactical situation with the methodical thinking that had kept him alive in dangerous circumstances before. The ranch house was defensible, with thick walls and clear sightlines in all directions. His weapons were adequate for a small-scale conflict, and Jake could provide additional firepower if necessary. The snowstorm, while limiting their options for escape or seeking help, also hampered any attack and made it difficult for Castellano's men to bring overwhelming force to bear. "We need to prepare for a siege," Sam decided. "If these men are professionals, they'll try to force a quick resolution rather than risk extended conflict in hostile territory. Our best chance is to make attacking us more costly than retreating." Margaret looked doubtful about their chances against trained killers, but Sam's calm confidence seemed to reassure her. She'd fled from Castellano because she'd seen no alternative to submission or death, but now she had an ally who was neither intimidated by wealth and power nor inexperienced in defending what mattered to him. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, her voice steadier now that they had a plan. "Help me move supplies and prepare defensive positions," Sam replied. "If we're going to be under siege, we need to be ready for anything they might try." The next several hours passed in intensive preparation. Sam moved ammunition, food, and medical supplies to strategic locations throughout the house, creating multiple fallback positions in case they were forced to retreat from one area to another. Margaret proved surprisingly knowledgeable about defensive tactics, suggesting improvements to his plans that demonstrated either extensive reading about military subjects or previous experience with dangerous situations. "You seem to know a lot about this kind of planning," Sam observed as Margaret efficiently organized medical supplies and emergency food stores. "Vincent's business attracted enemies," Margaret replied matter-of-factly. "His household staff learned to think about security as part of our daily routine. I probably know more about defensive preparation than most women my age." Another piece of the puzzle that was Margaret O'Brien, Sam reflected. Her education and capabilities continued to surprise him, revealing layers of knowledge and experience that seemed inconsistent with her claimed background as a simple domestic worker. Whatever her true story might be, she was clearly far more complex than she'd initially presented herself. By evening, they had transformed the ranch house into a fortress. Windows were barricaded with heavy furniture, leaving shooting ports for observation and defense. Food and water were distributed to multiple locations, ensuring they could survive extended conflict even if forced to abandon part of the house. Weapons were cleaned and loaded, with ammunition readily accessible from any defensive position. Jake arrived after dark, having spent the day concealing his own cabin and preparing his own defenses. The foreman's experience with range wars and rustler conflicts made him a valuable ally in planning their resistance to whatever Castellano's men might attempt. "Tracks disappeared in the snow," Jake reported, "but I found where they made camp about 2 miles north of here. Sheltered spot with good views of our approaches. They're definitely planning something, just waiting for the right moment." Sam nodded, unsurprised by the news. Professional enforcers would take time to study their target and plan their approach carefully, especially in unfamiliar territory during a snowstorm. The delay worked in their favor, giving them additional time to prepare and forcing the attackers to operate in increasingly difficult weather conditions. "How long can they wait in this cold?" Margaret asked, clearly hoping the weather might force Castellano's men to abandon their mission. "Men like that have survived worse conditions," Sam replied honestly. "They'll wait as long as necessary to complete their job, maybe weeks if they have to." The grim assessment sobered everyone's mood. A brief confrontation followed by victory or defeat was one thing, but the prospect of weeks under siege during winter storms was far more daunting. They had adequate supplies for extended conflict, but the psychological strain of constant vigilance would test everyone's endurance. As night deepened and the storm continued to howl around the ranch house, Sam found himself studying Margaret's face in the firelight. Fear was still there, but it was now tempered by determination and a kind of desperate hope. She'd spent months running from a past that seemed inescapable, but now she had someone willing to stand with her against the forces that had driven her into exile. "I'm sorry I brought this danger to your home," Margaret said quietly as they maintained watch from the living room windows. "You brought more than danger," Sam replied, his deep voice gentle but firm. "You brought life to this place, purpose to my days, hope for a future I'd stopped believing was possible. Whatever comes, I don't regret taking you in." Margaret's eyes glistened with tears at his words, but they were tears of gratitude rather than fear. For the first time since leaving Chicago, she felt she wasn't facing her troubles alone. The giant cowboy who'd rescued her from a stranded stagecoach had become something far more important than an employer or even a protector. He'd become the foundation of a life she wanted to fight for rather than simply endure. Outside, the wind continued to howl and snow continued to fall, creating a white barrier between the ranch and the outside world. Somewhere in that swirling darkness, dangerous men waited for their opportunity to reclaim what they believed belonged to their employer. But inside the warm ranch house, two people who'd found unexpected love in the wilderness prepared to defend not just their lives but their right to choose their own destiny. The storm that had brought Margaret to Sam's ranch was about to be matched by a human tempest that would test everything they'd built together. As midnight approached and the wind reached its fiercest intensity, Sam checked his weapons one final time and settled in for what might be the longest night of his life. Beside him, Margaret maintained her own vigilant watch, no longer the frightened fugitive who'd arrived seeking temporary employment, but a woman prepared to fight for the home and love she'd discovered in the most unlikely place. Dawn would bring either resolution or escalation, but whatever came they would face it together. The giant cowboy and the Irish immigrant had found something worth defending in each other, and neither Vincent Castellano nor all his hired killers would take it from them without the fight of their lives. The attack came at dawn, just as Sam had predicted. The snowstorm had finally exhausted itself during the night, leaving the valley buried under 3 feet of pristine white that would make movement difficult but not impossible for determined men. Sam spotted the first figure moving through the trees while the sky was still gray with pre-dawn light, a dark shape that didn't belong among the snow-laden pines. "They're coming," he said quietly to Margaret, who had been dozing fitfully in the chair beside the window. She came instantly awake, her green eyes clear and focused despite the lack of sleep. Over the past 24 hours, she had transformed from a frightened fugitive into a determined woman ready to fight for her freedom. 4 men emerged from the forest in a coordinated advance, moving with the professional precision Sam had expected from Castellano's hired enforcers. They wore heavy winter clothing and carried rifles, spreading out to surround the ranch house while maintaining communication through hand signals. These weren't common thugs or amateur intimidators, but experienced killers who understood their business. The leader was a tall, lean man with cold eyes and a face that had seen too much violence. Even at a distance, Sam could see the calculating intelligence that marked him as the most dangerous of the group.
Robert Walsh, the enforcer Margaret had described, a man who solved problems through methodical application of fear and brutality. "Miss O'Brien," Walsh called out when his men had reached their positions around the house. His voice carried clearly in the still mountain air, cultured and polite in a way that made his words more menacing rather than less. "Mr. Castellano has sent us to escort you home. If you come quietly, no one needs to be hurt." Sam positioned himself at a window that gave him a clear shot at Walsh while remaining protected by the heavy log walls. "This is private property," he shouted back. "You're trespassing. Ride away now and there won't be trouble." Walsh laughed, a sound devoid of genuine humor. "Mr. Carter, I presume. You've involved yourself in business that doesn't concern you. Miss O'Brien is the property of Vincent Castellano, and we're here to collect what belongs to him." The casual way Walsh referred to Margaret as property ignited a fury in Sam that he had to consciously control. His experience in dangerous situations had taught him that anger was useful only when channeled into effective action, not allowed to cloud judgment or compromise tactical thinking. "No person belongs to another," Sam replied, his voice carrying the absolute conviction of a man stating fundamental truth. "Miss O'Brien stays here by her own choice." "I'm afraid that's not acceptable," Walsh responded, his tone remaining conversational despite the deadly circumstances. "Mr. Castellano has invested considerable time and money in Miss O'Brien's education and training. She owes a debt that must be repaid, and she has compounded that debt by stealing money that didn't belong to her." Sam could see Margaret's face pale at the accusations, the guilt and fear that had driven her flight from Chicago returning with renewed force. But he also saw the determination in her eyes, the resolution of someone who had finally found something worth fighting for. "The only debt here is what Castellano owes Miss O'Brien for years of unpaid labor," Sam called back. "She's free to go where she pleases, and she pleases to stay here." Walsh's expression hardened, his professional patience wearing thin. "Very well, Mr. Carter, you've chosen to make this difficult. The consequences are on your head." The first shot came from the man positioned behind the barn, the bullet splintering wood near Sam's window. Instantly,
the ranch yard erupted in gunfire as Walsh's men opened up from their concealed positions. Sam returned fire immediately, his first shot taking down the gunman behind the water trough with the precision of someone who had learned to shoot under pressure. Margaret proved her worth immediately, taking up position at the kitchen window with the shotgun Sam had given her. When one of Walsh's men tried to rush the back door, she met him with a blast that sent him diving for cover, wounded and discouraged from further attempts at close assault. Jake Summers emerged from his cabin with a rifle, adding his firepower to the defense and forcing Walsh's men to divide their attention between multiple targets. The foreman had positioned himself perfectly to catch the attackers in a crossfire, and his first shots demonstrated the marksmanship skills that had kept him alive through years of range conflicts. The battle that followed was unlike anything Sam had experienced, even during his dangerous railroad work. Walsh's men were professionals who used cover effectively and coordinated their attacks, but they had underestimated both the defensive preparations and the determination of their opponents. The ranch house proved to be an excellent fortress, its thick walls stopping rifle bullets while the strategic windows allowed effective return fire. "You can't hold out forever, Carter," Walsh shouted during a brief lull in the shooting. "We have all the time in the world, and you're trapped in there." Sam considered their tactical situation with the calm analysis that had served him well in past crises. Walsh was wrong about having unlimited time. The gunfire would eventually attract attention from neighboring ranchers or passing travelers, and the territorial authorities would investigate reports of sustained combat. More immediately, the attackers were exposed to the brutal mountain cold while the defenders enjoyed warmth and shelter. "Actually," Sam called back, "I think time favors us. How long can your men stay effective in this cold? How long before someone investigates all this shooting? You're the ones who need to finish this quickly." The accuracy of Sam's assessment clearly frustrated Walsh, whose next attack was more aggressive and less carefully planned. Two of his remaining men rushed the house simultaneously from different directions, hoping to overwhelm the defenders through sheer audacity. Margaret's shotgun stopped one assault while Sam's rifle ended the other, leaving Walsh with only one functional subordinate. As the morning progressed, the tide of battle turned decisively in favor of the defenders. Walsh's careful professionalism gave way to desperate improvisation as his tactical situation deteriorated. The final assault came when he and his last man attempted to use fire as a weapon, throwing burning brands onto the roof in hope of forcing the defenders to flee into the open. Sam had anticipated this possibility and prepared accordingly. The roof was covered with snow too thick to ignite easily, and he had buckets of water positioned strategically throughout the house. More importantly, the fire attempt exposed Walsh to clear return fire from multiple angles. Jake's shot caught the enforcer in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him sprawling in the snow. The last gunman, seeing his leader wounded and their mission clearly failed, threw down his weapon and raised his hands in surrender. "Don't shoot," he called out. "I'm done. This ain't worth dying for." Sam kept his rifle trained on the surrender man while Margaret maintained watch for additional threats. Jake emerged from his cabin and approached the wounded Walsh with his own weapon ready, the foreman's expression showing no mercy for men who had attacked his employer and threatened an innocent woman. "Search them for additional weapons," Sam instructed Jake while keeping his own gun trained on the prisoners. "Margaret, check the house for damage while I figure out what to do with these men." The aftermath of the battle revealed the extent of their victory. Two of Walsh's men were dead, Walsh himself was seriously wounded, and the fourth had surrendered without achieving any of their objectives. The ranch house had sustained minor damage from gunfire but remained completely habitable, and none of the defenders had suffered serious injury. Walsh, despite his wound, maintained his arrogant demeanor even in defeat. "This isn't over, Carter," he said through gritted teeth as Jake bound his injury with rough efficiency. "Mr. Castellano doesn't accept failure, he'll send more men, better men." "Let him," Sam replied calmly. "But tell him that Margaret O'Brien is under my protection now, and I don't give up what's mine without a fight. If he wants to keep sending men to die in my valley, that's his choice." The emphasis Sam placed on calling Margaret his wasn't lost on anyone present, least of all Margaret herself. It wasn't a claim of ownership like Castellano's obsessive possession, but rather a declaration of commitment and protection. The giant cowboy was stating his intention to defend what they had built together, regardless of the cost or consequences. Jake brought rope from the barn, and they secured the prisoners properly while deciding their next course of action. The dead men would need to be buried, though the frozen ground would make that task challenging. More immediately, They needed to get Walsh medical attention to prevent him from dying of his wounds, not out of mercy but to avoid the legal complications that would result from killing Castellano's men. "We'll take them to town," Sam decided. "Sheriff Thompson needs to know what happened here, and these men need to face proper justice for their crimes." The journey to Willow Creek took most of the day, with the prisoners secured in Sam's wagon and the wounded Walsh barely conscious from blood loss and cold. Margaret rode alongside Sam, her presence serving as both a statement of her freedom and a reminder of what they had fought to protect. Sheriff Thompson listened to their account of the attack with the serious attention it deserved. He knew Sam Carter's reputation and had no trouble believing that wealthy men from Chicago might send killers to recover what they considered stolen property. The evidence was clear, the witnesses credible, and the legal situation straightforward despite its unusual circumstances. "I'll wire the authorities in Chicago," Thompson promised after hearing the full story. "This Castellano character needs to learn that his money doesn't give him the right to send armed men into my territory. These prisoners will face charges for attempted kidnapping, assault with deadly weapons, and trespassing with intent to commit violence." Walsh, despite his weakened condition, managed one final threat before being locked in the jail cell. "Castellano won't stop," he said, his voice weak but still carrying conviction. "He's got too much pride and too much money to let this go. You've won this round, but the war isn't over." Sam looked at the wounded enforcer with calm eyes that held no fear or uncertainty. "Then he'll lose the war too," he said simply. "Some things are worth fighting for, and some people are worth protecting. Tell your boss that if he wants to test that conviction, he's welcome to try." The ride back to Iron Bar Ranch gave Sam and Margaret their first opportunity to truly process what had happened and what it meant for their future. The immediate threat had been neutralized, but Walsh's warnings about Castellano's persistence couldn't be dismissed entirely. They had won a significant victory, but the war for Margaret's freedom might require ongoing vigilance. "Do you regret getting involved in my troubles?" Margaret asked as they approached the ranch house, which looked peaceful and welcoming in the afternoon sunlight despite the morning's violence. Sam considered the question seriously before answering. "I regret that it was necessary," he said finally. "I regret that men like Castellano exist and that women like you are forced to run from them. But I don't regret protecting you, and I don't regret having you in my life." Margaret felt tears well up at his words, but they were tears of relief and gratitude rather than fear or sorrow. For the first time since leaving Chicago, she felt truly safe, not just from immediate danger but from the deeper threat of returning to a life where she had no choices or control over her own destiny. That evening, as they sat by the fireplace in the ranch house that had proven itself a fortress, Sam made a decision that had been building in his mind for weeks. The events of the day had crystallized his feelings and his intentions, forcing him to confront the depth of his commitment to Margaret and their shared future. "Margaret," he said, setting down the book he'd been pretending to read, "I have something important to ask you." She looked up from her own reading, sensing the gravity in his tone. Over the weeks they'd lived together, she'd learned to read the subtle changes in his expression that indicated when something significant was on his mind. "Before today, I might have thought it was too soon or too presumptuous," Sam continued, "but facing the possibility of losing you made me realize that some things can't wait for perfect timing." Margaret set aside her book completely, giving him her full attention. Her heart began to beat faster as she sensed what might be coming, hardly daring to hope that her dreams of a real future with this remarkable man might actually be possible. "I want you to marry me," Sam said directly, his deep voice carrying both vulnerability and determination. "Not because of what happened today, not because you need protection or I need a housekeeper, but because I love you and I can't imagine my life without you in it." The simple honesty of his proposal brought tears to Margaret's eyes. There were no flowery speeches or romantic gestures, just the straightforward sincerity that characterized everything about Sam Carter. He was offering her not just his protection but his heart, his name, and his complete commitment to their shared future. "Yes," she said without hesitation, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, I'll marry you, Sam. I love you too, more than I ever thought possible." Sam's relief was visible as he crossed the room to take her in his arms, his massive frame enveloping her small one with infinite gentleness. For both of them, the embrace represented not just romantic love but the end of loneliness, the beginning of true partnership, and the promise of a life built on mutual respect and shared dreams. "I want to do this properly," Sam said, holding her close. "Church wedding, proper ceremony, all the traditions that matter. I want everyone to know that you're my wife by choice, not circumstance." Margaret nodded against his chest, understanding the importance of a public ceremony that would establish her status as a married woman rather than a fugitive seeking protection. Their marriage would be both a personal commitment and a legal shield, providing her with rights and recognition that would make any future attempts by Castellano far more difficult. The wedding took place 3 weeks later in the small church in Willow Creek, with the entire scattered community in attendance. Henry and Anna Muller served as witnesses, and Sheriff Thompson provided an official presence that emphasized the legal significance of the ceremony. Margaret wore a simple but elegant dress that Anna had helped her make, and Sam wore his best suit with obvious pride. Reverend Collins performed the ceremony with appropriate solemnity, understanding that this marriage represented more than just the union of two people, but the triumph of love over oppression, of choice over compulsion. When he pronounced them husband and wife, the gathered community erupted in genuine celebration for two people who had found happiness despite difficult circumstances. The winter that followed was harsh even by Wyoming standards, with storms that lasted for days and temperatures that dropped far below anything Margaret had experienced in Chicago. But the ranch house that had served as their fortress became their sanctuary, a place where they built the deep intimacy and partnership that would sustain them through all future challenges. Sam taught Margaret the finer points of ranch management, sharing his knowledge and including her in business decisions that would affect their shared future. Margaret brought her own skills to their partnership, handling correspondence and financial planning with expertise that helped their operation grow more efficiently and profitably. More importantly, they learned each other's rhythms and needs, developing the kind of comfortable compatibility that made their isolated life feel rich and fulfilling rather than lonely. Sam's nightmares from his railroad accident became less frequent and less severe, as if Margaret's presence had helped heal wounds that went deeper than physical injury. Margaret's constant vigilance and fear gradually relaxed, replaced by the secure knowledge that she was truly safe and valued. Spring brought news that Vincent Castellano had been arrested in Chicago on charges related to his business practices, his empire of intimidation and debt bondage finally collapsing under legal scrutiny. The investigation had been triggered partly by Sheriff Thompson's report about the attack on Iron Bar Ranch, which had drawn federal attention to Castellano's methods of dealing with runaway employees. Robert Walsh, serving a lengthy sentence in the territorial prison, had eventually provided testimony about Castellano's illegal activities in exchange for reduced charges. The enforcer's information had led to the discovery of other victims, other people trapped in situations similar to Margaret's who had been too frightened or too isolated to seek help. Margaret received official notification that all charges against her had been dropped, and that she was entitled to restitution for wages illegally withheld during her employment with Castellano. The money, when it finally arrived, was substantial enough to make significant improvements to the ranch, and to establish a financial foundation for their growing family. By the time autumn returned to Thunder Creek Valley, Margaret was pregnant with their first child. Sam's joy at the prospect of becoming a father was tempered by protective concern for Margaret's health and safety, but she faced pregnancy with the same practical competence she brought to all challenges. Anna Muller became an invaluable source of advice and support, helping Margaret prepare for childbirth in the isolated ranch setting. Their son was born during a blizzard in February, a robust infant who seemed perfectly suited to the harsh mountain environment where he would grow up. Sam held his son for the first time with hands that trembled despite their enormous size, overwhelmed by the responsibility and joy of fatherhood. "He'll be strong," Margaret said, watching her husband cradle their child with infinite tenderness. "Strong enough for anything this country can offer." Sam nodded, understanding that their son would indeed need strength to thrive in the demanding environment of the Wyoming frontier, but he would also have something equally valuable, the love and support of parents who had fought for their right to choose their own destiny, and who would teach him that some things were worth any sacrifice to protect. As the years passed, Iron Bar Ranch grew and prospered under the combined efforts of Sam and Margaret Carter. They added more children to their family, built additional buildings, and expanded their cattle operation into one of the most successful in the territory. Their marriage became a model for other couples in the scattered ranching community, demonstrating that partnerships based on mutual respect and shared goals could thrive even in the harshest circumstances. Margaret never forgot the fear and desperation that had driven her to Wyoming, but those memories served as reminders of how precious her freedom and security truly were. She became an advocate for other women in difficult situations, offering help and advice to those who found themselves trapped by circumstance, or threatened by powerful men who believed money gave them ownership over other human beings. Sam never forgot the loneliness and aimlessness that had characterized his life before Margaret's arrival, and he never took for granted the warmth and purpose she had brought to his existence. The ranch house that had once echoed with emptiness now rang with the laughter of children and the comfortable conversation of a couple who had built something lasting together. Vincent Castellano died in prison, his empire dismantled and his victims finally free to build lives of their own choosing. Robert Walsh served his full sentence and disappeared into obscurity, just another failed enforcer whose employer's fall had left him without purpose or protection. The threat that had once seemed so overwhelming proved ultimately to be no match for the combined strength of love, determination and community support. When Sam and Margaret's children were old enough to understand their family history, they heard the story of how their parents had met during a snowstorm and fought for their right to love each other. They learned that sometimes the most important battles were fought not for territory or treasure, but for the simple right to choose one's own path through life. The giant cowboy and the Irish immigrant had indeed given each other strong children by winter, children who would carry forward the values of courage, independence and unwavering loyalty that had enabled their parents to overcome seemingly impossible odds. In the end, love had proven stronger than money, honor more powerful than intimidation, and the bond between two people who chose each other freely more enduring than any force that sought to break them apart. 25 years had passed since the blizzard that brought Margaret O'Brien to Thunder Creek Valley, and the landscape of Wyoming had transformed as dramatically as the lives of those who called it home. The territory had achieved statehood in 1890, bringing with it the railroad connections, telegraph lines, and steady stream of settlers that Sam had predicted during those early conversations by the fireplace. What had once been a remote outpost accessible only by treacherous mountain trails, now boasted regular stage routes, a telegraph office, and even talk of extending the railroad spur to serve the growing ranching community. Sam Carter stood on the expanded porch of his ranch house, now a substantial two-story structure with dormer windows, and a wraparound veranda that offered commanding views of the entire valley. At 59, his massive frame had thickened slightly with age and prosperity, but his shoulders remained broad and his posture erect. The limp from his old railroad injury was more pronounced now, especially during cold weather, but it served mainly as a reminder of how far he'd traveled from those desperate days of uncertainty and isolation. The ranch itself had grown beyond anything Sam had imagined during those early years of struggle and determination. Iron Bar Ranch now encompassed over 2,000 acres of prime grazing land, supporting nearly 800 head of registered Hereford cattle that commanded top prices at markets from Denver to Chicago. The original log barn had been joined by 3 additional outbuildings, a modern dairy operation, and a bunkhouse that housed the 6 permanent ranch hands Sam now employed year-round. But the most significant changes were visible in the people who populated this thriving operation. Margaret emerged from the kitchen garden, where she'd been supervising the harvest of late-season vegetables, her auburn hair now threaded with silver but her green eyes as bright and intelligent as the day Sam had first met her at Muller's store. At 47, she remained the vital center around which the entire ranch community revolved, managing not only the household but serving as unofficial banker, teacher and medical advisor for the scattered families throughout the valley. Their eldest son, James Samuel Carter, had inherited his father's imposing height but combined it with his mother's quick intelligence and diplomatic skills. At 24, James was already being talked about as potential material for territorial legislature, his education at the University of Colorado having prepared him for leadership roles that went far beyond ranch management. He stood near the corral examining a promising young bull with the critical eye of someone who understood that careful breeding decisions today would determine the ranch's success for decades to come. The twins, Robert and William, had just turned 22 and represented 2 different approaches to the frontier life they'd inherited. Robert possessed his father's practical nature and hands-on approach to problem-solving, content to work with cattle and horses while gradually assuming greater responsibility for day-to-day ranch operations. William had inherited more of his mother's intellectual curiosity, spending his free time reading law books and corresponding with attorneys in Cheyenne about the legal complexities of water rights and mineral claims that would shape Wyoming's future development. Their only daughter, Margaret Rose, had just celebrated her 18th birthday and was preparing to leave for teacher training college in Denver, much to her parents' mixed pride and anxiety. Rose combined her mother's fierce independence with her father's protective instincts, creating a young woman who was equally comfortable delivering a calf or debating political philosophy with visiting dignitaries who stopped at the ranch during their travels through the territory. The youngest Carter's son Thomas Patrick had been born during the harsh winter of 1887, and at 16 already showed signs of surpassing even his father's impressive physical dimensions. Tom possessed a gentle nature that seemed incongruous with his massive frame, preferring books and mechanical devices to cattle and horses, though he could handle ranch work with casual competence when circumstances required it. As Sam watched his family move through their evening routines with the easy coordination of people who had worked together for years, he reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them all to this moment of prosperity and contentment. The ranch that had begun as a desperate attempt to build something meaningful from the wreckage of his railroad career, had become one of the most successful operations in the territory, but more importantly, it had become the foundation for a family legacy that would endure for generations. Margaret joined him on the porch, slipping her arm through his with the comfortable intimacy of a couple who had weathered every storm together and emerged stronger for the experience. She carried the evening mail, which now arrived regularly twice a week thanks to the improved transportation networks that connected Thunder Creek Valley to the wider world. "Letter from Anna Muller," Margaret said, settling into the rocking chair that had become her favorite evening spot. "She says Henry's finally agreed to retire and let their son Johann take over the store completely. About time, considering Heinrich is nearly 70 and has been talking about slowing down for the past 5 years." Sam smiled at the news. Henry and Anna Muller had become like family over the years, serving as surrogate grandparents to the Carter children and unofficial elders of the scattered ranching community. The success of Muller's store had paralleled the growth of the entire valley, expanding from a simple trading post to a substantial mercantile operation that served customers from 3 counties. "What else does Anna have to say?" Sam asked, settling into his own chair and accepting the coffee Margaret had brought from the kitchen. "The usual mixture of news and gossip," Margaret replied, scanning the closely written pages with amusement. "Young Doc Peterson is finally going to propose to the school teacher, the Methodist Church is planning a new bell tower, and there's talk of organizing a proper 4th of July celebration now that we have enough people to make it worthwhile." The mention of community celebrations reminded Sam of how dramatically the social landscape had changed since their early years of isolation. What had once been a collection of scattered homesteads connected mainly by necessity and mutual assistance had evolved into a genuine community with its own traditions, institutions, and shared identity. The Carter family had played a significant role in that development, with Margaret serving on the school board, and Sam helping to organize the Cattlemen's Association that protected their collective interests in territorial politics. "There's also a letter from Sheriff Thompson," Margaret continued, her tone becoming more serious. "He's retiring next month and wants to know if James might be interested in running for the position." Sam considered this information with the same careful attention he'd always given to important decisions. James possessed the intelligence, integrity,
and physical presence necessary for effective law enforcement, but the position would also expose him to dangers that went beyond the normal risks of ranch life. More significantly, accepting such a role would likely mean that James would need to establish his own household in town, rather than remaining as part of the ranch operation. "What does James think about the idea?" Sam asked. "He's interested but wants to discuss it with the family before making any commitments," Margaret replied. "I think he sees it as a way to serve the community while gaining experience that might be valuable if he decides to pursue political office later." The prospect of James leaving the ranch to forge his own path brought mixed emotions for Sam. Pride in his son's capabilities and opportunities combined with concern about losing the natural successor who would eventually inherit responsibility for everything Sam had built. But he'd learned over the years that trying to control his children's choices was both futile and counterproductive. Each of them needed to find their own way in the world, just as he and Margaret had done when they'd chosen each other despite the obstacles and dangers that had seemed insurmountable. As darkness settled over the valley, the family gathered for their evening meal in the spacious dining room that had replaced the simple kitchen table where Sam and Margaret had shared their first awkward conversations. The room reflected the prosperity and stability they'd achieved, with polished oak furniture, fine china, and elegant silver service that would have been appropriate in any wealthy household in Denver or San Francisco. But beneath the material success, the fundamental values that had guided their early struggles remained unchanged. Hard work was still expected from everyone, regardless of age or gender. Honesty and integrity were non-negotiable principles that governed all business and personal relationships. Education was prized not as a mark of social status but as a practical tool for understanding and improving the world around them. "Father," James said during a pause in the dinner conversation, "I've been thinking about Sheriff Thompson's offer and I'd like to hear your opinion before I make a decision." Sam set down his fork and studied his eldest son's face, seeing there the same serious consideration that James brought to all important matters. "Tell me what you're thinking and I'll share my thoughts." "The territory is changing rapidly," James began, his tone reflecting the analytical approach he'd learned during his university studies. "We're going to need law enforcement officers who understand both the old ways and the new realities, someone who can work with established ranchers like yourself while also dealing with the challenges that come with increased settlement and commercial development." Margaret nodded approvingly at her son's thoughtful analysis. "It's true that we need people in positions of authority who share our values and understand what this community has built over the years. On the other hand," James continued, "accepting the position would mean moving to town and probably delaying marriage and family for several years. It would also mean stepping away from ranch operations just when you might be ready to transfer more responsibility to the next generation." Sam appreciated his son's recognition of the competing considerations involved in such a decision. "James, when I came to this valley 25 years ago, I was running from a past that had left me broken and uncertain about the future. Your mother was fleeing from people who wanted to control her life and deny her the right to make her own choices. We built this ranch and this family because we believed that people should be free to determine their own destinies." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "If you believe that serving as sheriff would allow you to protect that freedom for others, then you should seriously consider accepting the position. If you're only thinking about it because you feel obligated to serve the community or because you think it's what I want you to do, then you should decline." James nodded slowly, clearly weighing his father's words against his own instincts and ambitions. "I think I am called to serve the community in some capacity, but I'm not certain that law enforcement is the right path for me. Perhaps I should focus on legal education and eventually seek elected office where I might have broader influence on policy and legislation." "That's a thoughtful approach," Margaret said. "There's no requirement that you make a permanent commitment to any particular career path at this stage of your life. You have time to explore different opportunities and find the role that best suits your talents and interests." The conversation that followed touched on the career plans and aspirations of all the Carter children, revealing the extent to which Sam and Margaret had succeeded in raising offspring who were both grounded in practical values and prepared to contribute to their rapidly changing society. Rose's determination to become a teacher reflected her desire to help shape the next generation of frontier citizens. The twins' different approaches to ranch management and legal studies suggested that the family's interests would be well represented in both agricultural and professional arenas. Even young Tom's fascination with mechanical devices positioned him to play a role in the technological developments that would define Wyoming's future. After dinner, Sam and Margaret took their customary evening walk around the ranch buildings, checking on the livestock and enjoying the crisp autumn air that carried hints of the winter to come. The routine had become one of their favorite parts of each day, a time for private conversation and reflection away from the constant demands of managing a large operation and raising a family. "Do you ever think about what our lives might have been like if that blizzard hadn't brought us together?" Margaret asked as they paused beside the creek that had given the valley its name. Sam considered the question seriously. "I try not to dwell on alternative histories," he said finally, "but I suspect I would have remained a lonely bachelor until old age, probably drinking too much and wondering why I'd never managed to build anything meaningful beyond a successful cattle operation." Margaret smiled at his honest assessment. "I think I would have kept running until I found some remote place where Castellano's reach couldn't extend, probably living under an assumed name and never allowing myself to trust anyone completely." Not exactly the foundation for a fulfilling life. They stood together in comfortable silence, listening to the gentle sound of water flowing over smooth stones and the distant lowing of cattle settling in for the night. Above them, stars blazed in the clear mountain sky with an intensity that still impressed visitors from more populated areas, a reminder of the vast spaces and endless possibilities that had drawn so many people to seek their fortunes in the American West. "I received some interesting news today," Margaret said after a while. "A letter from the Women's Suffrage Association in Cheyenne asking if I would consider speaking at their convention next spring about the experiences of frontier women in building communities and establishing businesses." Sam raised his eyebrows with interest. Wyoming had been the first territory to grant women the right to vote, a progressive stance that reflected the practical recognition that frontier communities needed the full participation of all their members to survive and prosper.
Margaret's involvement in various civic organizations had made her a respected voice in discussions about women's roles in territorial development. "Are you interested in accepting their invitation?" Sam asked. "I'm considering it," Margaret replied. "I think there are lessons from our experiences here that might be valuable for other women facing similar challenges in different parts of the country. The idea that women can be full partners in building businesses and communities rather than just dependents waiting to be protected or provided for." Sam nodded with admiration for his wife's continuing evolution as a leader and advocate. "You've certainly demonstrated that partnership approach in everything we've built together. I can't imagine anyone being better qualified to speak about the realities of frontier life and the contributions women make to community development." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats approaching from the direction of town, unusual at such a late hour unless something urgent required attention. Sam and Margaret exchanged glances of concern as they walked quickly back toward the house where James had already emerged onto the porch to investigate the disturbance. The rider proved to be young Billy Muller, Heinrich's grandson, whose flushed face and exhausted horse suggested he'd ridden hard to deliver whatever message he carried. Billy dismounted and approached the porch with obvious excitement, clutching a telegram that had apparently arrived after regular business hours. "Mr. Carter, ma'am," Billy said breathlessly, "this telegram came through on the late wire from Cheyenne. Grandfather thought you'd want to see it right away." Sam accepted the yellow envelope with curiosity tempered by concern. Urgent telegrams usually brought news of death, disaster, or significant business developments, none of which were particularly welcome during the peaceful evening hours he'd been enjoying with his family. The message was brief but momentous. "Wyoming achieves statehood effective July 10, 1890. Congratulations to all territorial citizens on this historic achievement. Governor Warren." Sam read the telegram aloud to his assembled family, and the significance of the news settled over them gradually. They had lived through the transformation of Wyoming from a remote territory governed by federal appointees to a sovereign state with full representation in Congress and complete control over its own affairs. It was the culmination of decades of population growth, economic development, and political organization that had finally convinced Washington that Wyoming was ready for self-governance. "This changes everything," James said, his legal education allowing him to immediately grasp the implications of statehood for existing laws, property rights, and political structures. "It changes some things," Sam corrected gently, "but the important fundamentals remain the same. We still need to work hard, treat each other fairly, and build communities that can withstand whatever challenges the future might bring." Margaret squeezed Sam's arm, understanding that he was thinking about the larger historical context of their personal journey. They had arrived in Wyoming Territory as individuals fleeing from pasts that had offered them no viable futures. They were ending that era as citizens of a new state, surrounded by children and grandchildren who would inherit opportunities beyond anything their immigrant ancestors could have imagined. As the family dispersed to share the news with neighbors and friends, Sam and Margaret remained on the porch watching the stars and contemplating the remarkable arc of their shared story. The giant cowboy who had rescued a stranded immigrant woman from a blizzard had indeed received strong sons by winter, along with a daughter whose intelligence and determination would shape the next generation of frontier leaders. But more than producing successful offspring, they had created something even more valuable, a partnership based on mutual respect, shared values, and unwavering commitment to protecting each other's freedom to choose their own paths through life. In a land that had tested their courage, endurance, and principles at every turn, they had not merely survived but flourished, building a legacy that would endure long after their own names were forgotten. The blizzard that had brought them together 25 years earlier had been just the beginning of their story, not its defining moment. Every challenge they had faced since then, from armed attackers to financial difficulties to the ordinary struggles of raising children and managing a complex business, had served to strengthen the bond between them and deepen their appreciation for what they had built together. As they prepared to enter their house for the final time as territorial residents, Margaret paused to look back at the valley that had become their home and the foundation of everything they valued. Tomorrow they would wake up as citizens of the state of Wyoming, but tonight they were simply Sam and Margaret Carter, a man and woman who had found each other during a storm and created something beautiful from the raw materials of determination, love, and unshakable faith in each other's worth. The telegram announcing Wyoming's statehood seemed to glow in the lamplight as Sam folded it carefully and placed it in his shirt pocket. This piece of paper would join the other treasured documents in the family strongbox: their marriage certificate, the deeds to their expanded property, and the faded letter that had originally brought Margaret to his ranch under false pretenses but true need. "Do you remember what you said that first night?" Margaret asked softly, her hand finding his in the darkness. "About building something lasting if a person was willing to work hard enough." Sam's weathered fingers intertwined with hers, calloused hands that had built not just a ranch but a dynasty. "I remember thinking I was talking about cattle and land," he replied with a quiet chuckle. "I had no idea I was actually talking about us." Margaret leaned against his massive shoulder, feeling the steady strength that had anchored her through every storm they'd weathered together. "The strong boys you wanted by winter became strong men who'll build something even better than what we created. Because they learned from a strong woman," Sam said, pressing a gentle kiss to her silver-threaded hair, "who taught them that real strength comes from choosing love over fear every single time." The sound of their children's voices drifted from the house as James organized a celebration of the statehood news, his natural leadership already evident in how the younger siblings deferred to his judgment. Rose was composing a letter to her college friends about witnessing history in the making, while the twins debated the economic implications of statehood for cattle prices and land values. Even young Tom had abandoned his mechanical drawings to join the family discussion about what this milestone meant for their future. "They're going to change the world, aren't they?" Margaret observed, pride evident in her voice as she watched their offspring through the window. "They already are," Sam replied. "James with his law studies, Rose with her teaching, the twins with their different approaches to business and agriculture. They're carrying forward everything we taught them about standing up for what's right." Margaret nodded, remembering the terrified young woman who had fled Chicago with nothing but stolen money and desperate hope. That frightened girl could never have imagined raising children who possessed the confidence to shape their society rather than simply survive within it. The transformation seemed impossible, yet here was the evidence, gathered around their dinner table discussing their dreams and plans with the casual assumption that anything was achievable through hard work and determination. "I sometimes wonder what Vincent Castellano would think if he could see us now," Margaret said, surprising herself by mentioning the name that had once filled her nightmares. "His property became the matriarch of one of Wyoming's founding families." Sam's arm tightened around her shoulders. "He'd probably convince himself that he deserved credit for educating you so well," he said with dry humor. "Men like Castellano never learn that you can't own another person's spirit no matter how much control you have over their circumstances." The mention of their old enemy no longer carried the power to disturb their peace. Castellano had died in prison years ago, his empire of intimidation crumbling once federal investigators began examining his business practices. The man who had seemed so powerful and threatening during those desperate early days had proven to be nothing more than a bully whose influence depended entirely on his victims' isolation and fear. "I received another letter today," Margaret said, pulling an envelope from her apron pocket. "From the Territorial Women's Organization. They want me to write a memoir about frontier life, specifically about women who came west to escape difficult circumstances and ended up helping to build new communities." Sam considered this request with interest. Margaret's story was certainly dramatic enough for a book, but more importantly, it contained lessons that could benefit other women facing similar challenges. Her experience demonstrated that apparent victims could become powerful agents of their own destiny given the right circumstances and support. "Would you want to write such a book?" he asked. "I think I would," Margaret replied thoughtfully. "Not just about my own experiences but about all the women I've met over the years who came west carrying secrets and found the freedom to reinvent themselves completely. Anna Muller fleeing religious persecution in Germany, Sarah Chen escaping an arranged marriage in San Francisco, even young widow Patricia Donnelly who brought her 3 children here after her husband died in a factory accident." Sam smiled at the mention of their neighbors and friends, each of whom had indeed arrived in Thunder Creek Valley carrying burdens from their past but had found opportunities to build better futures. The frontier had always attracted people seeking second chances, but women faced unique challenges in claiming those opportunities. "What would you call this book?" Sam asked. "I was thinking Strong Women by Winter," Margaret replied with a meaningful look at her husband. "Because that's what this country really needed. Not just strong boys to work the land and fight the battles, but strong women to build the families, schools, churches, and communities that turn wilderness into civilization." The title resonated with Sam on multiple levels. His original desire for sons to help with ranch work had been fulfilled beyond his wildest expectations, but Margaret was right that the true transformation of Wyoming Territory had required the contributions of determined women who refused to accept limitations on their potential. As midnight approached and Wyoming officially became a state, Sam and Margaret Carter stood together on the porch of the ranch house that had sheltered their love through every season of joy and sorrow. Around them stretched the land they had claimed and tamed, populated by cattle bearing their brand and children carrying their values into an uncertain but promising future. The blizzard that had brought them together 25 years earlier had been nature's way of ensuring that two wounded souls found each other when they needed healing most. Everything that followed, the confrontations with dangerous enemies, the struggles of building a business from nothing, the challenges of raising children in a harsh environment, had served to prove that love freely chosen was indeed stronger than any force that sought to divide or destroy it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities as Wyoming took its place among the United States. But tonight Sam and Margaret Carter were content to stand together under the infinite stars, grateful for every moment of the extraordinary journey that had transformed two desperate fugitives into the founders of a dynasty that would endure for generations yet unborn. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.